Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development and Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I am Cindy Dove here with Wes, and we're thrilled to talk about the 2025 Executive Summit with Dove Development and Consulting. So this exclusive event is designed to help you build a values-driven culture and legacy. Now, today we're diving into our second Executive Summit lesson, so second of the three that we'll have there that day, October 17th. This second session is titled Building a Culture Around Values, a Consistent Example. And it's from Chapter 8 of the Values Advantage, Wes's newest book, which isn't quite available, but he's finished it and it's coming.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cindy. The Executive Summit itself is really geared for supervisors, probably more senior supervisors, managers, and executives, even business owners that really want to make sure that their leadership culture is as strong as it can possibly be. Now, that said, we're not going to just focus on the folks that can attend the event because that's going to be in the Shenandoah Valley. We're capped at just 100 folks outside of our Impact Leadership Academy and our Executive Leadership Elite Think Tank, both public and private organizations that are part of that. So we want to make sure that we're covering the details of that, at least given a high level view, so anybody accessing this podcast can really take advantage. Now, that said, I'm going to pop over into the comments wherever you're accessing this, the URL for the Executive Summit, so you can learn more about that, and we'll circle back to that later on. But it's really based around, as we talked last time in the podcast, we talked about the first part of the Executive Summit, and that was looking at laying a foundation with our values. This section, the second session, after we do a roundtable discussion, we take a break, we pair folks up with a different group of executives and leaders that they can interact with. The second session is going to be based on, like you said, Chapter 8 of the Values Advantage, that really taps into building a culture around values, and it's really tied to a consistent example. Now, one of the things that we've seen, and I referenced throughout the book, some really, really close friends of mine, we met them now over 4 years ago. They acquired a business after a long corporate career, and they've since acquired 3 or 4 more, and the business has grown mightily in both revenue and more specifically profitability, but their culture has really increased too. And what we saw, our friends Craig and Kim, when I first started interacting with them in July of 2021, it was on Zoom. And interestingly enough, my camera didn't work in the first one. So what a terrible way to make a first impression. But I've got a new camera since, so we're okay with that. But when I first met them, I knew I was going to help with some of the acquisition paperwork, some of the HR, the employment law stuff that I really didn't like. But it was at a spot after COVID that I knew I needed to do anything I could to keep the lights on. And I heard from the beginning, as we're doing the handbook, as we're doing the acquisition, we're going to make every decision based on a core set of values. And they talked about their 5 values. They've added a 6th over the last year or so for one specific part of their business, but they didn't just talk about them. They really modeled them, and they didn't just model them in their own roles. They made sure that they were living out those values in every aspect of the business. I've so many times been on site, and we were just there yesterday as we record this, and we got to watch Craig interact with different customers. I've seen him almost every single time I'm there carry things to a customer's car. I've watched him bring carts back from a shopping from the parking lot and so on, and just look at ways that he doesn't just exemplify the humility and the compassion and the family and the dependability and the integrity that are their 5 values just for his own role as the owner, the vice president. Kim's the president because she's in charge, and like Cindy is for me. But I've watched Craig be very intentional and look at ways that he can exemplify and make sure that his team sees how the values in every aspect of that business can really be played out. How it can be something that everybody internally can really touch, see, and feel.
Yeah, and Wes, that reminds me too, in Chapter 8 of the Values Advantage, that's where you share how Craig models compassion, humility, and family, which is another one of their values. And I love your example of him carrying a customer's purchase to the car himself and being that example for his people. Him and Kim too, I see her doing the same when I'm there, really walking the talk consistently, not just talking about values in meetings. You know, it kind of takes me back because we have grandkids now that we spend as much time with as we can. But when our own kids were growing up and when we were kids. That's something we can all relate to, that we would watch our parents, and it wasn't necessarily what the adults in our life were telling us to do that we would demonstrate, but it was what they were doing. So we were watching our parents and the other adults in our life, and that's what we would duplicate. And it's really no different for us as adults as we're in the workplace now. I think you even quoted in that chapter a John Maxwell quote that where he says the only values that count are those in everyone's behavior all the time, because that's what's demonstrated. Those are the actual values. The culture of the organization is what the people are demonstrating each day.
Yeah, that's 100% correct, Cindy. Thanks for saying that. I'm going to take a quick segue and say I get to see. So when we broadcast this live and it goes to our Facebooks and our LinkedIn channels, we get to see some of the folks that make comments live. And our buddy Al Rutan is on with us from Winkler, Canada. Take off, Hoser. Hope you're doing well, brother. Great to hear from you. Thanks for joining in with us. Now, with what we're going to be doing at the Executive Summit, specific to this lesson about building a culture around values, and we talk about those consistent examples, we're going to walk through not just examples of what we've seen Craig and Kim do, but of many of the businesses that we've worked closely with. We're going to talk through how we display things like compassion in tough situations. How can we make sure that the integrity that we have on the wall or we have in our handbook really is tied through every tough decision we make? And I'll say in the now 4 years that we've interacted with Craig and Kim, there have been plenty of tough decisions that they've had to have, but they've always, in every single one, modeled compassion, humility, and specifically family to make sure that they're taking care of the customer, the client, the team member, anybody that's involved in that. We're going to work through those. Now, if you're not able to join us, that's okay. We want you to think through, what are my values? What do they look like in practice? And am I modeling in those in every single situation that I deal with? Because, hey, if we're able to connect those behaviors to our team's role, we're not leaving anything to chance. If we don't make sure that we're doing that, our team members are left with no other option than to make their own decision on how's this defined? What does this look like in my role? And if we let it vary, it absolutely will. Now, in the chapter, in the lesson we talk about, I share an article from Forbes, and I've referenced it a lot over my years with behavior-based safety, but the Forbes article gave some stats, and it talked about how kindergarten teachers say they compare leaders to kindergarten teachers and talk about setting an example for others to follow. And the reality is, what I learned in behavior-based safety and the whole world of psychology is, whether we're 8 or we're 58 or anywhere in between, we're not really making decisions on different factors. It's always about what's the expectation, what are we held accountable to, and what are we seeing modeled. And that's just a big piece of how we do that within our teams. And when we learn to recognize what the teams are doing, when we learn to make sure that we're applying those things in our own behavior, we can do that well. And we've got to make sure that we're recognizing not just the behavior. We've got to address and hold accountability for behavior that's out of line, but we've also got to recognize the behavior that is exactly what we want. And, I watch with Craig and Kim specifically, and so many other amazing leaders that we get to work with, I watch them look for opportunities to recognize and even praise their team members, sometimes individually, sometimes in front of a group, for the specific behaviors that model their core values. Now, I give an example in the chapter of the book about when I was teaching our son to play catch, and he was holding the glove the wrong way, and based on if it was a pop-up, if it was up in the air, he maybe could have done a basket catch and caught the ball effectively. But if the ball's coming straight at him and he's trying to catch it the same way in a basket, it could glance off the heel of his hand and hit him in the face and lose his teeth. And I didn't have time or money to go to the dentist or to take him into the dentist at that point. So what I had to do is not just highlight what he was doing wrong, make sure every time he did it right, I would recognize that specific behavior, because recognized behavior gets repeated every single time. If that's the bad behavior, we're reinforcing that, and it's probably going to get repeated too. We need to make sure that we're highlighting the specific outcomes we're after so we can build a stronger culture, and that stronger culture ultimately builds retention with our existing team, especially the great ones that live into those values, that love accountability, that want to be top team players, but it also attracts great people as well.
Wow, I love that, Wes. And it's that recognition that builds culture. At the executive summit, I want to build out a little bit of what attendees will experience. So, attendees will leave with strategies that will really make their team values non negotiable, similar to Chick-fil-A's my pleasure. That's a non negotiable value in their organization. It's an expectation that everyone rises to. There's a whole story that we shared on our last segment with our first our first session that we'll be talking about at the Executive Summit. So go back and listen to that podcast or wherever you're listening to it on social media about Chick-fil-A's My Pleasure and how long it took Truett Cathy to get that through the organization. So it's really a shocking number of years. But those non-negotiables like Chick-fil-A's My Pleasure is what you'll build out through your organization. So we're going to learn strategies about that. Attendees will also learn how to explain what each value looks like in action, avoiding assumptions that are really going to derail clarity for your people. Because if we don't offer clarity to each of our employees on what each of the values of our organization look like demonstrated through their behaviors, they can have their own interpretation of what the values of the organization are and what that's supposed to look like. And that's absolutely not what you want. Leaders need clarity themselves, so we have to gain that first. Then they can pass that clarity on to their team. And what's the result of that? A stronger team with strong buy-in, lower turnover, and a culture that really attracts top talent and keeps top talent. So the Executive Summit Roundtable model will let you share these ideas after we went through them, after you've learned them and just devise strategies. Then the Roundtable model will let you share these ideas with peers, really refine your approach so you can make a measurable impact, like Craig's 5% revenue boost from visibility.
I remember the first time we had the conversation about them adding visibility potentially to one aspect of their business. And that was a theory. And he gave me an example of where he was trying to work to, in team members' roles, exemplify that visibility so they could see what it looked like, how their customers and clients could feel it in their interaction with the team. And with that one interaction he shared with me, it was a customer, they own a landscape and garden center business, and this was primarily in the garden center where it's very customer facing. And one of the things that they've historically, even before they bought the business, they've always stressed, we're going to model that high-end customer service. This isn't going to be a big box retail store that just happens to have a garden center with plants. We're going to give expertise. We're going to give compassion. We're going to do all these things. And the very first example I remember Craig sharing of when he was still thinking about visibility being a value, one customer interaction that had he not made sure he was visible, had he not worked with the customer directly, it wouldn't have resulted, they wouldn't have had a sale at all. And that one sale resulted in 10% of the revenue for that entire day with that one customer through him being visible. So when he shared that 5% revenue boost, I said, well, maybe over time it might shake out. It might just be, but I would argue it's going to be more because that one interaction resulted in 10% for your entire day when you showed your team members what it looked like. So it was just fun to talk through that. Now, in that format, in the Executive Summit, we're going to work through things like that. And if you're not there, that's okay. I would challenge you to think, how do you work through those with your team members? How do you interact with your team to make sure that they know and understand what those values really do look like? How are they exemplifying them? How are they applying them? In the Executive Summit, after Cindy and I share the lesson, we give some practical steps and takeaways and so on. We're going to break up into our small groups. We'll have groups of 5, I think, around the room, about 125 people, where we've got strategic questions we're going to be prompting them with to have very intentional discussion around each of those, to where they can talk about across their industries, with all of them having the same responsibility for leading teams, how can they identify specific action steps that they can take, and even more specific return on investment that they want to achieve through it. Because the reality is, if they don't make it actionable where they can see the behavior and they don't have a clear target that they're aiming for, the likelihood of them achieving it is really, really low. So we're going to work really, really intentionally throughout that entire day about how can we do that? How can we build it in? Now, I've shared in the chat or in the comments or in the text, wherever you're accessing this, the link to register. But just in short, it's L2L, the letter L, the number 2, the letter L hyphen Harrisonburg.com is where the registration information is. But if you're not going to be there, that's okay. Now, what I'm going to say is we'll soon have the Values Advantage released. It'll be on Amazon. It's going to be early 2026. We'll be able to go into some of that with you in more detail. We'll run some pretty cool things along with that. And we're right now working through the process because our entire Leadership Legacy Experience in June of 2026 is going to be themed around that. And it's not going to be just about here's what Wes and Cindy are seeing. We're working with about a dozen different business leaders to have them put real life examples, real world examples of what they see, what they do, what they experience in their own organizations, and how they make sure those values are not only identified, but embodied, and it carries over into the customers. And we'll base the theme around it, but it's all going to be included in the book. So there's going to be a lot of cool things that we put together, and it's not going to be just a one-off for an event. It should be an entire experience that you can take advantage of, whether you're reading it, whether you're listening to the Audible at that point, or whatever it may be.
So in short, the second lesson at the Executive Summit, again, October 17th, second lesson, building a culture around values, is really going to be about being the consistent example that your team needs, learning how to model core values daily to foster a really strong, unified team culture that boosts engagement and retention, and discover practical strategies and real-world examples to make values non-negotiable. And again, the roundtable discussion so you can hone your skills and learn from other leaders in the area. You know, building cultures like we're speaking about and working people towards is not easy, but it's how you build a culture that lasts. So we hope that you can join us at the Executive Summit to help make that happen.
Yep. Again, registration will be wherever you're accessing this. We've also got some stuff with this Leading at the Next Level podcast from the very beginning. We've always wrapped up by saying if the event that we're talking about here specifically is not for you, that's okay. God bless you. We appreciate having the time with you through this. We want to give you something that you can take away, especially if you've got a need for continuing education credit through either the Society for Human Resource Management or the Human Resource Certification Institute. We've invested heavily into a couple different things, into being approved providers with both, but also into a digital program where we do live sessions monthly, but we also have a library of now more than 160 lessons that are proprietary. We've written real world example, real life experience in those spaces that matter for leadership, all of which are approved, that we can give you a 45-day trial for by sending us an email at admin@dove-development.net. And again, we'll hook you up with that. We do some different stuff around discounts after it and so on. We love to be able to serve you in that way if it gives you value, and we feel like it will. So with that said, we appreciate you being with us on the Leading at the Next Level podcast, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Make it a great day, and God bless.